Next on The Impossible State, what does Kim's help to Putin mean for the war in Ukraine? We'll be having a conversation with one of this country's leading journalists, someone who you have seen on TV quite often. Next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Good evening to those of you in Asia. Good morning to those of you here on the East Coast of the United States. And good day to all of you elsewhere in the world and in the country. My name is Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Professor at Georgetown University. And welcome to another episode of The Impossible State. Today, we're going to be talking about what Kim's support of Putin means for the war in Ukraine. And we are joined by I'm really excited. We are joined by one of this country's leading journalists with regard to Russia and Russia-related issues. You have seen her for years on CNN. She's now a professor at Georgetown University, so we're really happy to have her at Georgetown as well. Jill Dougherty. Jill, let me properly introduce you, although you need no introduction to our audience. So Jill Dougherty is an expert on Russia. She is currently teaching at Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies. She is also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute Advisory Council. She has been pursuing research on Russia and the media as a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at Harvard, at the Wilson Center, and at the International Center for Defense and Security in, is it Tallinn?
Tallinn,
yeah. Estonia. But you will all know her for the 3 decades she worked as a correspondent for CNN, where she worked on Russia and the post-Soviet region. She served as CNN Moscow bureau chief for almost a decade, and her other postings included the White House, the State Department, U.S. Affairs editor, and managing editor for CNN International, which was based in Hong Kong. Right. She is now a CNN on-air contributor, commenting on Russia and Russia-related issues. Her articles, books, and book reviews and commentary have appeared in The Atlantic, Politico, Washington Quarterly, The Washington Post, CNN. She hosts a blog on Russia issues sponsored by the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center that goes by the name Kennan X. That is really cool. And of course, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and World Affairs Council. Jill, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm so glad to be here, Victor. Really, it's a treat because you're the expert for me.
Well, that's very kind of you. We're really happy to have you teaching at Georgetown now. So what are you teaching now at Georgetown?
I teach 2 courses. One that right now that I'm teaching is in information wars, disinformation, propaganda. Focus on Russia, but we get into a little bit of China, a couple of other countries, but basically Russia. And then in the spring, I teach a course that I call the Putin Generation. I may have to change that name, but it's about young people. Who are the young people in Russia? And the ones who have grown up with no leader other than Vladimir Putin, are they different?
Oh,
that's the gist of it, yeah.
Interesting. And this is graduate level?
It's both undergrads and graduate students. It's at the School of Foreign Service.
Wow, that's terrific. So that's why you should come to Georgetown, everybody out there listening. You get to get professors like Professor Dougherty. Okay, so to get us started, Jill, so you've been following what's been going on with regard to the war in Europe now. I've been watching you, reading your commentaries. It's not a topic we often talk about on this podcast because we're focused more on sort of North Korea, the Korean Peninsula. But maybe we could start off by you just giving us your views on the current state of the war situation. Are we reading the papers about this counteroffensive and how it's been going? Is there a stalemate? Is an armistice possible? We'd love to just sort of start off by hearing your views on this.
Yeah, it's, at this point, obviously there's more attention being paid to the Middle East, but we will eventually get back, I'm sure, to what's happening in Ukraine. But up to this point, I'd say it's kind of a situation of stasis. If you look at the counteroffensive or the Russians pushing back against that, it's literally, a kilometer here, 5 kilometers there. It's just kind of back and forth with not a whole lot of progress. I do think it's not as bad as it was perceived for the Ukrainians a while ago. But I'd have to say that, long term or kind of big picture for Putin, remember, he went in there expecting it to be over in a few days. And it is now more than a year and a half, and it shows no sign of ending. And I think for Putin, that could be his strategy at this point. Just play it out, try to decimate Ukraine as much as he can, create havoc in Europe, wait until the Allies fall apart, wait until the American election in 2024. And he has an election, by the way, in March of 2024, too. But I think if he's, around, he will probably win that, surprisingly. So I think there's a big waiting game. But in the meantime, and I think this is where Korea comes in, North Korea, it's truly an ammunition war at this point of just burning up enormous amounts of ammunition. And that is where your fantastic research about supplies going back and forth comes in.
Yeah, thanks. So before I want to talk about that, but before I go to that, you mentioned sort of the Middle East and Gaza. And I guess the question I have is there a worry about war fatigue in Ukraine now that there's, as a journalist, I all the focus is on Gaza right now.
Yeah.
And so how does that affect the war in Ukraine?
Well, you just have to turn on the TV to see that basically you don't see a lot of news about Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a function of TV. There is no question that what's happening in the Middle East is horrendous, very compelling. It's human stories. And so it's going to, command a lot of airtime. But I think, there are interesting connections. In fact, just this morning, Victor, I was watching CNN, and there was a live shot from the region, from Israel, and the anchor was saying that she had been taken to a store of weapons that Hamas had, according to the Israeli forces. And the Israeli forces were showing her that collection there. And interestingly, she said the weapons were coming from Iran and, guess where? North Korea. So there's a lot of weaponry floating around in conflict zones really around the world. And I think that's where you get this connection, hidden transfers, money being shipped back and forth, weapons being shipped back and forth. And remember Prigozhin, Mr. Prigozhin, who had the Wagner group, and who was killed in the plane crash recently. They were, of course, taking money from the Russian government and from their work in Africa and all over in conflict zones and buying weapons. And they were also involved with the North Koreans. So here we go with these connections interlocked.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. So speaking about munitions and arms transfers and the way Russia is blowing through all this ammunition in the war in Ukraine, so the White House released some very interesting imagery this week, and I really give the administration and DNI Haynes credit for, downgrading this information so that it could be released to the public. And here we see very clearly the case of this is in Najin Port in North Korea. So we're here, Najin Port in North Korea. There are all these containers. Of approximately 300 shipping containers that have been staged at Najin Port. And John Kirby, our friend John Kirby, was at the podium and presented this graphic in which we see that the White House argues these munitions are moving from Najin Port. They are going to Russia, and then we see this long train ride here to get it to the other side of Russia for the war in Ukraine. So this is what the White House released this week. Whenever the White House releases imagery like this that we can't access, we immediately look at the location and the timestamp, and we collect commercial imagery of our own. And so this is a story that we've released this week where we're here looking at, this is a close-up of Najin Port. And you can see that there are shipping containers here, right? This is Pier 3, and there are shipping containers here at Pier 2. And I want to make sure that this version of it has it. These are photos from October 16th. And here's a photo from October 13th of one of the ports where there's more containers here. So these are the Kirby statement said that they thought there was a shipment. Their photos showed there was a shipment sometime between early September and the first week of October. These are pictures from this week, right? October 13th, which means that there are more shipments now going. Yeah. It was not just the original 300 containers, but there's clearly a lot more stuff that's going over there. And so I guess the question I have for you, Jill, is someone who has covered this, and I've seen you sort of talking about the war itself. Like, how much is this stuff? If we assume that this is all ammunition, like how much is this stuff actually helping Putin? The White House initially, when they talked about the Wagner shipment, said that the North Koreans are shipping some stuff to the Wagner group, but it's not going to affect the overall outcome of the war. I've noticed that they don't say that anymore. Right? They don't say that anymore. So I'm curious as to, when you see something like this, what are you thinking?
Well, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but from what I understand, this, when we were talking about burning through a lot of ammunition, this that is coming from North Korea, which I understand produces enormous amounts of maybe not that sophisticated artillery and munitions, but it is enough for the Russians, because if they have to in any day launch, enormous amounts of ammunition, they themselves can't produce that much. They're trying to crank it up, but at this point they can't. So they need as much as they can get. And even if it is, World War II level in sophistication, it's very helpful because they just want to pound the other side. That's essentially what they're doing. And that is the dilemma for the Ukrainians, that they don't have enough artillery either. They don't use as much, nearly enough, as much as the Russians do. So I think artillery, even though it seems kind of primitive in its sophistication, is really crucial to this war.
Yeah, I think there was even a report that at one point in territory that was taken by the Ukrainians, that they had found some North Korean munitions there and were using it against the Russians. So North Korean munitions were ending up on both sides of this, but clearly because they were being sourced to Russia.
Victor, I just want to say, one of the reasons that they can both use them is that they have Soviet weapons. They still have some Soviet weapons. So it's interoperable.
I see.
This is not NATO quality, but it's the old Soviet stuff.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So then if the game plan for Putin is to just, to try to wear the other side down, like go through another winter, right, in Europe, wait for the U.S. presidential election, a year from now, then this constant supply of munitions is allowing Putin to carry out that strategy.
Definitely. Yeah. And actually, a slow approach might be what he wants. Obviously, his original idea was to go all the way to Kiev, get rid of Zelensky, take over the government, and control Ukraine. But that said, I think at this point it is just a pounding. I'm not quite sure what he thinks he's going to accomplish with this, other than there's that element of the punitive side to this that is really frightening in a way. Right. Why he is specifically doing this.
And going after civilian targets and things
definitely.
like that. Yeah. Horrible situation. So the one other thing I wanted to ask you about is that there are many things that have caught the attention of countries in Asia with regard to this war, but one of them were threats that Putin had made early on in the war. I don't know if he made them recently, threats about the possible use or first use of tactical nuclear weapons. I think it was in the event of NATO intervention or at the prospect of NATO intervention. So I guess two questions. One is the context in which Putin has made this threat. And then second, is it a real threat? I mean, in your mind, is this something that Putin could actually consider? And the reason I ask this is if we go back to the Korean Peninsula, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, as soon as Putin said this, sort of adopted this wholesale into his sort of strategic or nuclear doctrine, the prospect of the first use of tactical nuclear weapons to deter others.
Yes. Okay. So there's so many levels to this, but I'd say, number one, we have to distinguish, as we both know, between tactical and strategic. So strategic nuclear weapons, ICBMs, streaking across the sky at Washington is not what we're talking about. We're talking about tactical, smaller, but very powerful nuclear weapons that could be used in the battlefield, on the battlefield. Now, I think the reason that Putin brings this up is because basically that is his only game at this point. His economy is weak. His military really did not perform very well in the beginning, to say the least. They have been improving somewhat, but really it was a bad show in the beginning for an army that we all thought was quite powerful. So, he needs to show that he can do something. And what does he turn to? He turns to nuclear weapons, which are frightening and would mean true either devastation or the scare tactics that he can use, I think are all part of this. He gets the world worried and the West worried about the fact that he might use these weapons. Now, I think there's another. I watch Russian TV a lot indirectly, kind of, and if you look at Russian TV almost any night, they have talk shows. And on those talk shows, they have usually kind of bloviating people who have the Kremlin message, and they yell at each other back and forth. And the conversation is often, we ought to drop a bomb on Paris, or we ought to drop a bomb on London, or maybe even Washington, D.C. So Putin comes in, and when he does this, he uses kind of an indirect approach sometimes. We have the potential for things that don't sound like we will drop a bomb. This is not TV talk shows, but it's disturbing because it is Putin, president, who does have the power to drop a bomb on Washington. So sometimes he plays the role of, scaring the West, and at other points, internationally and domestically, he plays the role of the adult in the room who's saying, well, what we actually could do, and the other could do now gets into conventional weapons. Because, just as we are speaking, the Russian government, their parliament, is trying to pull back its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which it actually did, sign and ratify. Now they're saying, well, the United States may have signed it, but they didn't ratify it. And look what's happening. We should pull out too, in a mirror image of what the United States is doing. So there too, that's kind of, it's nuclear, it's testing, it's not attacking, but pulling out of a test ban treaty is pretty serious. Yeah. So this is all, I guess we could say again, saber rattling. But the problem is you don't always know that it's definitely going to be saber rattling. I mean, there could be an existential moment where Putin decides that he would do this. So my mind, I guess, says, yes, it is possible that he would do that. I do not think it's probable. And I think he's rational about these things as much as, He can be rational. So, but it's very frightening because enter Kim Jong-un and enter other people in the Russian government who would actually, I believe, want to drop a bomb on Berlin, Paris, Washington.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. The way you just described this sort of these roles that different people play in this is not dissimilar from what we see in North Korea, in the sense that in 2017, when Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump were going head-to-head, threatening each other, that was pretty frightening. But then with the appearance of his younger sister, right, Kim Yo-jong, right. It's interesting because she's now sort of taking the role as the hardliner. She's the one who sort of really spews vitriol at South Korea, at the United States. And Kim is more silent. The leader, Kim Jong-un, the older brother, is more silent on these things. So it's so it's playing this balancing out, what Thomas Schelling used to call it the threat that leaves something to chance, right? To try to get everybody a little bit nervous about what they're doing, and it's meant to have sort of a deterrent effect. But that's interesting. I did not know that they were looking to find ways to get out of the CTBT. That's actually very interesting and very concerning. So one other question I wanted to ask you on this particular topic is just your views on NATO support right now. Do you see NATO support as strong? I mean, we've been through one winter. We're about to go through another one. How do you see things there?
Yeah, I think it's quite strong. I mean, I don't see any diminution in support for Ukraine. I think from NATO. In fact, if you look at some of the NATO countries, there's no question that they are really devoted. The Baltics, especially, Estonia, the percentage that they give to their defense has increased. So they're on board. I think the danger for Ukraine is more political, and actually here in the United States, by ultra-conservatives who make the case, well, we don't really have the money to do this, That is a false issue. The United States does, at least at this point, have enough to be able to continue to help Ukraine. But I'm worried that this is really in danger, in a sense that we have the political chaos on Capitol Hill, and there are many people involved in that chaos who really do not want to help Ukraine, are sometimes even more positive to Russia's role in this, surprisingly. So I think that's the danger.
Yeah, and the continuing resolution, right? They had to pull the Ukraine part out of their continuing resolution.
Exactly.
That's not a good omen. I mean, one of the interesting things is that now that North Korea is involved in Ukraine, through this support of Putin, it's raised a lot of discussion in South Korea about the role that South Korea should play because, North Korea has basically now pulled Korea into the Ukraine war. And in particular, as we'll talk about in a minute, if Putin's providing other stuff to North Korea, that's a problem for South Korea. So I just came back from South Korea, where I wouldn't say it's dominating the conversation, but there's more talk now about what more should South Korea do. They provide a lot of humanitarian assistance. They've backfilled Poland and the U.S. Army with munitions. If there's any place in the world there's a stockpile of munitions, it's on the Korean Peninsula. And South Korea's stuff is much better than North Korea's stuff. So it'll be. I'm watching that very closely. This South Korean president is a very forward-leaning person when it comes to the war in Ukraine. He's talked about it. He's used very strong language with regard to it. I think he's almost testing his public to see where they stand on South Korea doing more. So that's, I think, going to be interesting to watch. If we could turn now to this meeting that took place between Kim and Putin. I mean, I watched it with a great deal of interest, had some thoughts about it from a Korean, North Korean perspective. But I'm curious, I don't really have a sense of how Putin looked at this meeting. Of course, he wanted the munitions, but and I think it's not the first time they met. They met in 2019 in Vladivostok. But from your perspective, how does Putin look at that meeting with this odd man from North Korea. Yeah.
Well, I think you nailed it in the sense that Kim can provide something that Putin needs right now. And Putin really is not necessarily a long-term strategic thinker. He's very tactical. And at this point, the war, I don't think he knows where the war is going. And maybe we don't even understand, maybe he doesn't have a complete strategy on Ukraine to begin with. Where does he want this to go? So he needs something right now, and here's where he can get it. I do think that it must be galling to the diplomats in Russia who used to deal with, European countries and with Japan and Korea, the big nations, the important nations, and now are dealing with their best friends are North Korea and Iran.
Right.
It must be truly, I think, for some of the very seasoned diplomats in Russia, it must be galling.
Right.
So I do think, if you look at it, they've been asked, the press secretary for Mr. Putin was asked, why are you having this relationship with North Korea? And it's the usual, well, we have good relations with every country. But I do think, Victor, when you were talking about the Defense Department, NSC, talking about and releasing this information, they are using that pre-buttal, as we call it in the propaganda world, pre-buttal more and more. And I think it's really effective, just calling their bluff. Because I remember when the invasion happened in February of 2022, I actually was in Moscow for CNN, filling in with some commentary. And I remember the Russians, anchors looking at their watches saying, well, the U.S. says we're going to invade. So it's Tuesday, 5 p.m. We haven't invaded yet. When's the invasion coming? And of course, the invasion came within days. So calling their bluff and making these things public, I think, is very effective. Very effective.
Yeah, that is interesting. The opportunities for Russian diplomats with countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia, and others in the region, now to the extent they even talk to them at all, the conversation is probably only about one thing now, right? Which is, what are you doing with North Korea? What are you doing with Iran? It's really something. From the Asia perspective, this Kim trip to Russia was actually very important for the North Korean leader. They were just coming out of a 3-year lockdown over COVID. Prior to that, the North Korean leader was embarrassed by failed summitry with Donald Trump, right? He took a train, he doesn't like to fly, so he takes a train all the way to Vietnam, Hanoi in 2019. Trump ends the meeting early, doesn't even attend the lunch and says, we're leaving. And Kim has to take the long train ride back. It was, the United States, we're used to sort of criticizing our leaders and everything. But as you know, in North Korea, they have this carefully crafted myth of the leader and how great he is. And for him to lose face like that was really big. So this Putin need for ammunition for Ukraine was like a gift to the North Korean leader, where he could, in one sense, come out of the pandemic with this big trip, and then two, be in a situation now where Russia needs stuff from North Korea. Historically, it's always been the other way around. North Korea needs patron aid from the Soviet Union, Russia. North Korea needs debt relief from the Soviet Union, Russia. Now it's reversed, and so for Kim, this is like he feels like he's in a great place. The other thing that we're concerned about is North Korea is providing munitions, and the North Koreans need food and fuel coming out of a 3-year COVID lockdown. But there's a lot of concern in national security circles that Putin might be willing to provide other things. For me, I can't imagine the North Korean leader going to Russia for this, whatever it was, 6-day trip just for food. I don't think he'd do that, right? And now we have imagery and we have statements from the White House that shows that a deal was clearly made before this, because there are like hundreds of containers going to Russia. So The concern is that they might be providing technology, Russia might be providing technology for military satellites, for nuclear-powered submarines, for ICBMs. And so I guess the question I have is, do you think that's possible? Do you think that Putin would do something like that that has obviously broader ramifications for the United States and Homeland Security? Do you think that Putin would do that?
I think he would. Sadly, I mean, that I think is the scariest thing of all, that he would break, UN resolutions, Security Council resolutions, to do that. And maybe a few years ago, you'd think, no, he wouldn't go that far. But I think at this point, you have to look at the way he looks at the world. And right now, he looks at the relationship with the West as he is involved in a war with the West. Ukraine, he would argue, is not really the issue here. It's really the West exploiting Ukraine to try to attack Russia. And the country is Russia is increasingly on a war footing economically, and I think that changes the dynamics. So, the things that might have held him back may no longer hold him back as much as they did. And you look at some of the, in your studies here and your pictures, there's a lot of subterfuge. They're covering them with tarps and hiding them, and the ship transponders are turned off and things like that. You don't do that unless you're moving something that's important and you don't want it to be seen. They're not moving food in that way, as you pointed out. So I think it is entirely possible that he would do that.
Yeah, 10 UN Security Council resolutions, right? The Russians had signed on to 10 UN Security Council resolutions. And they're all, and to your point about Russian, you said earlier that he's a rational actor, but like even rational actors, when they get into desperate situations, they become more risk acceptant, right? They're willing to do things they wouldn't do otherwise, and Putin could very well be in that situation. Okay, so just to let's finish on a small topic, and I say that sort of sarcastically, and that is China. Right. We were talking earlier before we went on air that we believe that Putin right now is in Beijing.
He's going to be at the Belt and Road Forum or meetings.
Yeah. And so, we're speculating, but how do you think that the Chinese are looking at this newfound cooperation between DPRK and Russia?
Yeah, because China supposedly has influence, and that's usually the way it's looked upon, at least by the West, that China could be a mitigating, force with North Korea. That part of it, I don't really quite understand. I don't see that China has maybe as much influence. I'm not an expert in that particular relationship, but as much as maybe others expected. But I do think that China vis-a-vis Russia, it's, they still don't, they call it a partnership, no limits partnership. But it's not really, it's not a, it doesn't go beyond a partnership, technically using that word. So what is it? Well, they carry out military exercises together. But I think that there's something else that they're doing, which is really based on ideology and their view of the world, so that they both resent the United States running things in the world. Putin believes that the United States goes around the world telling people what to do. And he has found, compatriots in China who look at it in the same way. So that conversely, if you create problems for the hegemon, then that's a way of taking action against the hegemon. So the more chaos in the world, the more unpredictability, the more like, what is North Korea up to with Russia? That all helps Putin because it's very unclear. It's almost, I would argue, a propaganda technique by Russia itself to make the world as confusing and scary as possible. keep people on edge, not know exactly what he's up to or what Kim is up to or where this is all going. And that works for Putin because he doesn't have a lot of positive diplomatic force in the world right now. It is pretty much negative, and that negativity does help him.
Yeah, I mean, this point about chaos and disorder, I think that, certainly the North Koreans would view chaos and disorder as a good thing. I'm sure both of them unfortunately welcome what is happening in Gaza as well, creating
sadly.
more uncertainty. I think in terms of China, there's probably a violent ambivalence to what is happening between DPRK and Russia. On the one hand, I think that they don't like North Korea getting too close to Russia. Historically, they've never liked it when North Korea gets too close to Russia, and they've tried to pull them back, engage them, and pull them in. On the other hand, I think, if they can make the world more complicated for the United States, there's something to be said for that as well.
Nice.
So I'm really interested to see what comes out of this, these meetings. Wang Yi, when he's been asked about it, has just defaulted to these very bland talking points about, that's a bilateral issue between DPRK and Russia. We're not involved in any of that. But personally, I think it's in China's interest not to support this. It's because they don't want East Asia, they don't want their region pulled into the war in Europe. This is pulling this region into the war in Europe. There's no way China wants that. How is that good for China? But at the same time, I don't think they can get out of their own way in terms of doing something that's in their interest if it ends up looking like it's helping the United States. I think that's very difficult for them. But I guess we'll just have to see what comes out of this meeting. Jill, this has really been a fascinating discussion. Your decades of expertise on Russia is sorely needed right now. We really appreciate your coming on the show. We have to have you back again as things develop.
I'd love to.
And thank you again for coming.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed the conversation very much. Maybe enjoy is not the word, but it was stimulating.
Yes. And I want to sit in on your class on Putin's, was it Putin's Generation?
Oh, the Putin Generation,
that's just the title of that course. And so that's it for another episode of The Impossible State. Thank you to all of our listeners and viewers online, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks for the next edition of The Impossible State.